David sat in his small apartment eating dinner from a plastic container. The TV was on, but he wasn't really watching. This had become his life for the past 3 months. Work, home, sleep, repeat. His friends kept telling him to get back out there, but he wasn't ready. The divorce papers were still sitting on his kitchen counter. He should have put them away by now, but somehow seeing them there reminded him that this new life was real. His ex-wife had moved on quickly. She was already dating someone new, posting happy pictures on social media while David was learning how to cook for one person. The apartment felt too quiet most nights. He'd gotten used to having someone else around, even during the bad times. Now the silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on him from all sides. He'd tried listening to music, but that made him think of songs they used to play together. He'd tried reading, but his mind would wander after a few pages. That Tuesday, evening started like all the others. David had just finished his microwaved dinner when he heard a soft knock on the door. He wasn't expecting anyone. His friends usually called first, and delivery drivers knocked much louder. When he opened the door, he couldn't believe who was standing there. It was Lisa, his ex-wife's younger sister. They'd always gotten along well during family gatherings, but she'd never come to his place alone before. She looked different somehow, more confident. There was something in her eyes that he'd never noticed when they were all together as a family. "Hey, David," she said with a small smile. "Can I come in?" He stepped aside without really thinking about it. She walked past him into his living room like she'd been there 100 times before. The apartment suddenly felt smaller with her in it. She looked around, taking in the changes he'd made since the divorce. "You've rearranged everything," she said, running her fingers along the back of his couch. "Yeah, well, I needed to make it feel different," David replied, closing the door. "Can I get you something to drink? Water? Coffee?" "Coffee sounds good," she said, settling onto his couch like she belonged there. As he made coffee in the kitchen, David tried to figure out why she was there. They'd seen each other at his mother-in-law's birthday party last month, but that was with the whole family around. They'd talked and laughed like they always did, but nothing seemed unusual. Now she was in his apartment on a random Tuesday night. "So what brings you by?" he asked, handing her a mug and sitting in the chair across from her. Lisa wrapped her hands around the warm mug and looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I've been thinking about you," she said simply. The way she said it made David's heart skip a beat. There was something in her voice that he'd never heard before, something that made the air in the room feel different. "Thinking about me how?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "About how you're doing, about how hard this must be." She took a sip of coffee and watched him over the rim of the mug. "Everyone's so focused on my sister and her new relationship. Nobody talks about how you're handling everything." David felt something tight in his chest loosen a little. It was true. Even his closest friends seemed to think he should be over it by now. They meant well, but they didn't understand how it felt to watch someone you'd planned to spend your life with move on so easily. "It's been rough," he admitted. "Some days are better than others." "I can imagine." Lisa set her mug on the coffee table and leaned forward slightly. "You know, I always thought she didn't appreciate you enough." David felt heat rise to his face. He'd never heard anyone in the family say anything like that before. They'd all been supportive during the divorce, but they'd never taken sides. "Lisa, you don't need to say that." "But it's true," she continued. "I used to watch you two at family dinners. You'd try so hard to make her laugh, to include her in conversations. She barely looked up from her phone half the time." David had never realized that anyone else had noticed. Those family dinners had become painful toward the end of his marriage. He'd felt like he was performing, trying to prove to everyone that they were still happy together. "I noticed other things too," Lisa said quietly. "What do you mean?" She smiled then, and it was different from her usual friendly smile. This one seemed to hold secrets. "I noticed how you'd look sometimes when you thought no one was watching, like you were somewhere else entirely." David felt his pulse quicken. He had no idea what to say to that. The conversation was moving into territory he'd never expected. Lisa stood up and walked to his bookshelf, running her finger along the spines of his books. "You have good taste," she said. "I never knew you liked mystery novels." "There's probably a lot you don't know about me," David said, and immediately wondered why he'd said that. She turned back to him with that same knowing smile. "Probably. But I'd like to find out." The words hung in the air between them. David felt like he was standing at the edge of something he didn't understand. Lisa moved closer, and he caught the scent of her perfume. It was different from what her sister used to wear, warmer somehow. "David," she said softly, "when was the last time someone really saw you?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He realized he couldn't remember. Even in the good times with his ex-wife, he'd felt invisible sometimes, like he was just playing a role rather than being himself. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I see you," Lisa said, and the way she said it made David believe her. They stood there looking at each other, and David felt something shift inside him. For the first time in months, he felt truly awake. The careful routine he'd built around himself, the walls he'd put up to protect himself from feeling too much, all of it seemed to crack just a little. Lisa reached out and touched his arm gently. "I should probably go," she said, but she didn't move toward the door. "You don't have to," David heard himself say. She smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes completely. "I was hoping you'd say that." Lisa didn't leave that night. Instead, she curled up on David's couch and they talked until almost midnight. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, even though David knew it probably wasn't smart. She told him things he'd never known, about her life, about feeling like she was always in her sister's shadow, about her own recent breakup with someone who never really understood her. "He was nice enough," she said, tucking her legs under her. "But he looked at me like I was just another pretty face, like there wasn't anything interesting going on behind my eyes." David found that hard to believe. Even as kids, Lisa had been the one asking questions that made adults uncomfortable, the one who noticed things others missed. "That says more about him than it does about you." "Maybe," she said with a sad smile. "But after a while, you start to wonder if maybe there really isn't much there." "That's not true," David said firmly. "I remember when you were 16 and you spent that whole summer volunteering at the animal shelter. You came home crying every day because you couldn't save all of them." Lisa looked surprised. "You remember that?" "Of course I do. You had dirt under your fingernails for 3 months and you didn't care because those animals needed you." David paused. "I always admired that about you. You felt everything so deeply." Something changed in Lisa's expression then. She looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. "You really did notice me back then." "I noticed everything about your family," David said honestly, "including you." The conversation continued, moving from childhood memories to dreams they'd never shared with anyone else. Lisa talked about wanting to travel, to write, to do something that mattered. David found himself opening up about his own fears, about feeling like he'd lost himself somewhere in his failed marriage. "I used to paint," he admitted, "before I got married, before I got so caught up in being the perfect husband. I haven't touched a brush in years." "What did you paint?" Lisa asked, genuinely curious. "Landscapes mostly. Nothing fancy, just places that made me feel peaceful." David looked around his apartment. "I should probably start again. I have all this empty wall space now." "You should," Lisa said. "I'd love to see your work sometime." As the night wore on, David became increasingly aware of how Lisa moved through his space. She got up to get water and somehow knew exactly which cabinet held the glasses. She commented on the changes he'd made since the divorce, pointing out improvements he'd been proud of but never shared with anyone. "You've made this place feel like you," she said, running her hand along the bookshelf he'd built himself. "It never felt like you before." "What do you mean?" "When I'd come over for family dinners, everything felt so careful, like you were both trying so hard to prove something." Lisa turned to face him. This feels real now, like you're not pretending anymore. David felt something stir in his chest. Nobody had ever put it quite like that, but she was right. His old life had felt like a performance most of the time. The moment that changed everything happened when Lisa was looking at the photos on his mantle. He'd kept a few family pictures, the ones where everyone looked genuinely happy. She picked up one from last Christmas and studied it carefully. "Look at your face in this picture," she said, holding it out to him. "Even when you're smiling, you look sad." David looked at the photo and saw what she meant. He'd been trying so hard to look happy for the camera, but his eyes gave him away. "I was sad," he admitted. "I just didn't want everyone to know how bad things had gotten." Lisa set the photo down and moved closer to him. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said softly. "I see you, David, the real you." She was standing close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough that he could smell her shampoo. The air between them felt charged with something he hadn't felt in years. "Lisa," he started, but she reached up and touched his face gently. "I know this is complicated," she whispered. "I know we shouldn't, but I can't stop thinking about what it would feel like to be with someone who actually sees me." David's heart was racing. He knew they were about to cross a line they couldn't uncross. He knew this would complicate everything with her family, with his ex-wife, with his entire future. But looking into Lisa's eyes, he also knew he'd never felt more understood by another person. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, giving her one last chance to step back. Instead of answering with words, she moved even closer. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." When she kissed him, it was gentle at first, almost hesitant. But when David responded, when he pulled her closer and kissed her back with months of loneliness and longing, something ignited between them that felt like coming alive after being asleep for years. The weeks that followed were unlike anything David had ever experienced. Lisa would show up at unexpected moments, always with that same confident smile that made his heart race. She'd appear at the coffee shop where he grabbed lunch, sliding into the seat across from him, like they'd planned to meet there all along. "I was in the neighborhood," she'd say, but they both knew she lived 20 minutes away. These stolen moments became the highlight of David's days. He'd find himself checking his phone constantly, hoping for her messages. They weren't long or elaborate, just simple things like "thinking about you" or "wish I could see you right now," but they made him feel more alive than he had in years. Lisa had a way of making every encounter feel special. She'd remember tiny details from their conversations, bring him coffee the way he liked it, notice when he got a haircut. It was everything his marriage had lacked in the final years, and David found himself falling deeper into whatever this was between them. But it was also exhausting trying to keep it secret. Family dinners became minefields, where David had to be careful about every glance, every word. His ex-wife would be there sometimes with her new boyfriend, and David would have to pretend he was fine while Lisa sat across the table, occasionally catching his eye with a look that made him forget where he was. "You seem different lately," his brother-in-law mentioned one evening after dinner. "More, I don't know, energetic?" David's heart jumped. "Just trying to get my life back together," he said casually. "Maybe picking up some new hobbies." Lisa was helping clear dishes and overheard. She gave him the tiniest smile, and David had to look away before anyone noticed the heat rising to his face. The sneaking around was thrilling at first, but it started to wear on David as the weeks passed. He'd catch himself lying to friends about where he'd been, making up excuses for why he couldn't hang out certain evenings. The worst part was lying to himself about what this really was. Lisa never made promises about the future. She never talked about leaving her family or making their relationship public. She seemed content to exist in these stolen moments, and David began to realize that maybe that was all this would ever be. One evening, she showed up at his apartment after he'd had a particularly difficult day at work. His boss had criticized a project he'd worked hard on, and David was feeling sorry for himself when he heard her familiar knock. "Bad day?" she asked, reading his expression immediately. "The worst," he said, letting her in. Instead of offering sympathy, Lisa walked straight to his kitchen and started making dinner. She'd apparently stopped at the grocery store and bought ingredients for his favorite meal. As she cooked, she told him funny stories about her day, gradually pulling him out of his bad mood. "How did you know exactly what I needed?" David asked as they ate. "Because I pay attention to you," Lisa said simply. "I know when you're stressed you forget to eat properly. I know when you're upset you get quiet and start overthinking everything. And I know that your favorite comfort food is your mom's spaghetti recipe." David stared at her. "You learned my mom's recipe?" "I called her last week and asked for it. Told her I wanted to surprise you." Lisa grinned. She was thrilled that someone in the family was looking out for you. The thoughtfulness of it overwhelmed David. His ex-wife had never cared enough to learn what comforted him when he was down. But Lisa had not only figured it out, she'd gone out of her way to make it happen. "You're incredible," he said softly. "I'm just someone who sees you," she replied. "Really sees you." But even as David felt more cared for than he had in years, a part of him started to worry. Lisa had a power over him that felt both wonderful and dangerous. She could make his whole day with a single text, or leave him anxious for hours if she didn't respond quickly enough. He was becoming dependent on these moments with her, living for the next time she'd show up unannounced. His own life started to feel less important than waiting for her to be part of it. And somewhere deep down, David began to wonder if that was exactly what Lisa wanted. The family barbecue at Lisa's parents' house was supposed to be a simple Saturday afternoon gathering. David had almost decided not to go, but his mother-in-law had specifically asked him to come. Even after the divorce, she still treated him like family, and he didn't want to hurt her feelings. When he arrived, the backyard was already full of people. Kids were running around with water balloons, adults were gathered around the grill, and everyone seemed relaxed and happy. For a moment, David felt like maybe he could just blend into the crowd and get through the afternoon without any drama. Then he saw his ex-wife near the picnic table with her new boyfriend. They looked comfortable together, laughing at something, on her phone. David felt the familiar pang in his chest, but it was different now, less sharp, more like remembering an old injury than feeling a fresh wound. "You made it," came a familiar voice behind him. Lisa appeared with 2 cold drinks, handing him one with a smile that looked perfectly innocent to anyone watching. "Thanks," David said, taking the drink but trying not to look at her too long. Being around her in public always made him nervous now. "Relax," she said quietly, moving to stand beside him. "We're just family friends catching up." But Lisa seemed to have a different idea about how careful they should be. Throughout the afternoon, she found excuses to be near him. When he was talking to her uncle about work, she'd appear with snacks. When he was playing catch with the kids, she'd cheer from the sidelines just a little too enthusiastically. The moment that changed everything happened when they were both in the kitchen getting more ice. The room was empty except for them, and Lisa moved closer than she should have. "I miss you," she whispered, even though they'd seen each other just 2 days before. "Lisa, someone could walk in," David said, but he didn't step away. "I don't care," she said, and for a second she looked like she meant it. "I'm tired of pretending we don't mean anything to each other." Before David could respond, Lisa's mother walked into the kitchen. She stopped short when she saw them standing so close together, and David watched as understanding dawned in her eyes. She looked from Lisa to David and back again, and David knew their secret was out. "Oh," Mrs. Rodriguez said simply. "I see." The 3 of them stood there in awkward silence for what felt like forever. Finally, Lisa's mother walked to the refrigerator, got what she needed, and left without saying another word. But the look she gave David as she passed told him everything he needed to know. The rest of the barbecue was torture. David tried to act normal, but he kept catching Lisa's mother watching them. Worse, he started noticing other family members glancing their way with curious expressions. Had they been more obvious than he thought? Lisa, on the other hand, seemed almost relieved. She didn't try to hide her smiles anymore or make excuses to talk to him. If anything, she seemed more relaxed than she'd been in weeks. "What are you doing?" David asked her quietly when they found themselves alone by the garden. "What do you mean?" You're acting like you want everyone to know." Lisa was quiet for a moment, pulling dead flowers off her mother's rosebush. "Maybe I do," she said. "Finally. Lisa, think about what you're saying. Think about your family, about my relationship with them." "I have been thinking about it," she said, turning to face him. "I've been thinking about it every day for weeks. And you know what I realized? I'm tired of hiding who I am and what I want." David felt panic rising in his chest. "But this affects more than just us." "Everything affects more than just us, David. But at some point you have to decide if you're going to live your life for other people or for yourself." That evening, after most of the guests had gone home, Lisa's mother asked David to help her carry some dishes to the kitchen. Once they were alone, she turned to him with a serious expression. "How long has this been going on?" she asked directly. David considered lying, but something about her tone told him she already knew the answer. "A couple of months," he admitted. She nodded slowly. "And are you both serious about this, or are you just playing around?" The question caught David off guard. He'd been so focused on the excitement and secrecy of it all that he'd never really asked himself that question. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Well, you better figure it out," she said, not unkindly. Because Lisa isn't the type of girl who plays games. When she cares about someone, she cares completely. And if you're not prepared for that, you need to end this before someone gets hurt. David spent the drive home thinking about what she'd said. Was he serious about Lisa? The question made him realize how little they'd actually talked about the future. They'd been so caught up in the intensity of their connection that they'd never discussed where it was leading. When he got home, Lisa was waiting in his apartment. She'd used the spare key he'd given her weeks earlier, something that had felt romantic at the time, but now made him wonder how deeply involved they'd become, without him realizing it. "We need to talk," she said before he could even close the door. "Yeah, we do," David agreed. They sat on his couch, and for the first time in months there was tension between them that wasn't the good kind. "My mom talked to you, didn't she?" Lisa asked. "She did. She wanted to know if we were serious about this." "And what did you tell her?" David took a deep breath. "I told her I didn't know." Lisa's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "At least you're honest. Lisa, I care about you. You know I do. But I don't know what this is or where it's going. We've never talked about it." "Because you've never wanted to talk about it," Lisa said. "Every time I try to bring up anything beyond right now, you change the subject." David realized she was right. He had been avoiding those conversations, content to live in the moment without thinking about consequences. "I've been scared," he admitted. "Scared of hurting you, scared of losing your family, scared of making another mistake." "Well, now we don't have a choice," Lisa said. "People know. My mom knows, and probably half the family suspects something. We can't go back to pretending this isn't happening." David looked at her and saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Vulnerability mixed with determination. For the first time, he realized that Lisa might be just as scared as he was, even though she hid it better. "So what do we do?" he asked. "We figure out if this is real," she said, "or we end it now before it gets any." 3 days after the barbecue, David's phone rang at 2 in the morning. It was Lisa, and she sounded different. Tired, maybe even a little lost. "Can I come over?" she asked. "I know it's late, but I can't sleep." "Of course," David said, instantly awake. When she arrived 20 minutes later, she looked like she'd been crying. Gone was the confident woman who'd been walking through his life like she owned it. Instead, she looked younger, more fragile than he'd ever seen her. "What happened?" David asked, pulling her inside. "I had a fight with my sister," Lisa said, sitting heavily on his couch. "She knows about us." David's heart sank. "How?" "Mom told her. She was worried about the family dynamics, about you getting hurt again." Lisa laughed bitterly. "Apparently, everyone's been protecting everyone except us." David sat beside her, unsure what to say. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but he'd hoped they'd have more time to figure things out. What did she say? He asked. That I was being selfish. That I was playing with people's lives for my own entertainment. Lisa's voice cracked. She said I was just like her, always taking what I wanted without thinking about consequences. That's not true, David said automatically. Isn't it? Lisa turned to look at him. Be honest, David. Haven't I been doing exactly that? Haven't I been taking what I wanted from you without really thinking about what it meant? The question hung between them. David wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. There had been something almost predatory about the way Lisa had pursued him, something calculated about her confidence. I think we've both been doing that, David said, carefully. I think we've both been using this to avoid dealing with other things. Lisa was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was so tired of being invisible, she said. My whole life I've been the younger sister, the one who wasn't as successful, wasn't as put together. When I was with you, I felt powerful for the first time. I felt like I mattered. You do matter, David said. But not because I made you. Want me, Lisa replied. That's not real power. That's just manipulation. David felt something shift inside him as he realized she was right. The dynamic between them had been intoxicating, but it hadn't been healthy. They'd both been using each other to feel better about themselves, rather than actually connecting as equals. So what does that mean for us? David asked. Lisa stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the empty street below. I think it means we need to be honest about what this really was. And what was it? It was two lonely people finding each other at exactly the wrong time, she said. It was real, but it wasn't right. David joined her at the window. I don't regret it, he said. I don't regret caring about you. I don't regret it either, Lisa said, but I think we both deserve better than what we've been doing to each other. They talked through the night, finally having all the conversations they'd been avoiding. For months, Lisa admitted that she'd been using their relationship to feel valued, while David confessed that he'd been using it to avoid dealing with his own loneliness and failure. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else needs, Lisa said as dawn broke outside his window. Me too, David agreed. I need to learn how to be alone without being lonely. As the sun came up, they both understood that something was ending. But for the first time since they'd started whatever this was, it felt like an honest ending. Lisa stood to leave, and David walked her to the door. She paused with her hand on the doorknob. You know, for a while there, I really did think I owned you, she said with a sad smile. But I think I was the one who was trapped. We were both trapped, David said. But maybe now we can both be free. Lisa kissed him gently on the cheek, not passionately, but with genuine affection. Thank you for seeing me, she said. The real me, not just the confident version I was pretending to be. Thank you for waking me up, David replied. Even if we weren't right for each other, you reminded me what it felt like to be alive. David watched her walk to her car, knowing this was really goodbye. It hurt, but it was a clean hurt, like setting a broken bone properly. It would heal correctly. Now, as her taillights disappeared down the street, David felt something he hadn't expected. Relief. For the first time in months, he didn't have to pretend to be someone he wasn't. He could just be David, alone, but not lonely, ready to figure out who that person really was. He had some painting to do,